Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate that. As Jackie mentioned, I did put together, it's a combination of the intertwining history between Lake Tahoe and Western Nevada in the early Comstock era. Without further ado, let's move forward. So for me, I like to tell stories. I mean, it's going to be history, but I like to share about people and characters and events and things of that nature. Before we get into the more modern history from the 19th century, I think it's important to understand that the Native American presence here goes back to the end of the last ice age, about 9,000 years, and particularly for the Washoe tribe, which would be in what is today kind of eastern California and far western Nevada. The Washoe tribe would frequently come up as soon as the snow melted out of the Tahoe Basin. They would come up into the lake, and they would go to places like Squaw Valley and these camps that they had around Lake Tahoe. And the men could hunt game and antelope and bear and go fishing. The women could weave baskets. They could dig for the medicinal roots of plants. And it was a very powerful spiritual place for them. Lake Tahoe is the center of their spiritual world. And it was every summer that brought them back after a long, hard winter, surviving down in the cold, high desert. Our modern history begins around 1843 to 1844 when a topographical engineer, a guy named John Fremont, was coming out to the far west. This was the second of what is going to be ultimately 5 expeditions. So it's mostly scientific to create better and more accurate maps because the region was very poorly understood. This is when California is still Mexico. And we are still going to be 4 years before the discovery of gold in California. So as we start to think about this early westward migration, pre-gold rush, it's going to be more part of this concept of manifest destiny and American exceptionalism, where the people are going to push the western boundaries of the United States, where we had started in the Atlantic, and push it all the way to the Pacific. But before you're going to send families out in covered wagons, it'd be helpful to know kind of how to get here and what things look like. And in fact, the map that was in existence when John Fremont came out showed rivers draining out of what today would be the Utah area and going right to the Pacific coast. And it was Fremont he's doing this big navigation of 2,000 miles by horseback with his group of about 40 men, that he sees the Sierra Nevada range and he realizes there's no way rivers can drain from the interior and make their way to the coast. And in fact, it was after this expedition when he wrote a book that became very popular. I always say that was the last time a geography book was ever a bestseller in the United States. But he came up with that term, Great Basin, where the water drains in, but it doesn't come out. And that was a completely new concept to people from both Europe and from the East, where rivers get more and more robust until they finally burst into the ocean. So it was a completely new concept. And we credit John Fremont with his cartographer, a guy named Charles Price, who climbed a peak about 15 or 16 miles south of Lake Tahoe itself when they were doing a midwinter, February 1844 Trans-Sierra crossing. They happened to climb a peak on a clear day. They were looking around to get the lay of the land. They look to the north. They see Lake Tahoe. Now, these guys were running out of food. They were really afraid. They're up in the high mountains with all the snow and everything. But ultimately, these are the first guys that put it on the map. And that would be February 14th, Valentine's Day of 1844. And then to show you how quickly things happen in that very same year, but after the summer in September, the very first covered wagons have made it across what we now call the Humboldt River across northern Nevada, and then made it out to this area. And ultimately, when the party got stuck at Donner Pass, they didn't really think that that was the smartest way to go. They sent a splinter group of 6 people down along the Truckee, upstream on the Truckee River from where Donner Lake is today. They became the first non-American Indians to set foot on the beach in Lake Tahoe. So everything kind of happens in 1844. That is the Tahoe breakout year in many ways. You know, it's interesting, we have the name Tahoe, and it seems like it's been that way forever, but it kind of started that way, it changed a couple times, and it took a long time to get back to being Lake Tahoe. First of all, we get that name Tahoe from, it sounds phonetically like a Washoe word that means edge of the lake or big water or something like that. So Tahoe is an interpretation of what their word was for that lake. However, the gentleman on the left is John Bigler. He's going to be California's third governor. Well, a few years before, he had been part of this small rescue operation. Some wagons and families had gotten caught up at South Lake Tahoe, because they're going to use the Carson Pass, not the Donner Pass, gotten trapped up there, and he and some other men had gone up and rescued them. Well, once he's elected, he's got all of his yes men around him, and they're like, yo, John, remember that lake up there? And they've got that Indian name or something for it? Well, heck, we should name it after you. That's a better name. And everybody said, yeah, let's do it. So it starts moving forward that it's going to be called Lake Bigler. Well, there's a lot of other people who really didn't like that. And what slowly happens is, in his first role as governor, as he's getting near the end, he comes out as a supporter of the Confederate movement, and because we're leading up into the Civil War. Now, there were plenty of Confederate sympathizers in the West. However, California had come in at 1850 as a free soil state, no slavery. Nevada was going to come in the same way. However, that made John Bigler a very less popular man. And people started to push this movement to change the name back to Tahoe. California's official map maker came out with a map in 1861 that had Lake Tahoe on it, sent it back to Washington, D.C., said, we are calling this Lake Tahoe. This is what it looks like. All your future publications should call it Lake Tahoe. The Fed said, sounds good to us. But then the party in power in California decided, oh no, you can't hijack that name for our governor. And they went through and they passed the legislation that year in 1861, making Lake Bigler the official name of what we now call Lake Tahoe. And to show you how complicated California's politics are, despite everyone's resistance to that and popular sentiment against that, it took until 1945 for California to repass legislation officially naming it Lake Tahoe and not Lake Bigler. And that's why you will frequently see the lake with both names on it. And when you read journals and diaries from latter 19th century people coming through, some will call it Tahoe, some will call it Bigler. It all depends on what you felt like getting into. Well, here's a photograph of Chief Truckee. It's the only picture that we know that's legitimate of that guy. And his real claim to fame, and he's got a whole story, we don't have time for that, but the fact is, as a teenager, he had had visions and dreams. And this is what's going to lead him to be one of the shaman, one of the medicine man of the Paiute Indians. Now, it's a very scattered tribe. It's not like you think of these, the Apaches or the other strong Plains Indians where they have one very strong leader. Chief Truckee wasn't that kind of a guy. And the Paiute culture, they were a very poor culture. No metalworking technologies, very few horses. Because of the sparse vegetation, they really couldn't support herds of horses. They just didn't have it. Anyway, Chief Truckee had had this dream when he was young that all people, no matter what their skin color, all come from the same family in the beginning. So in reality, we're all brothers and sisters. Well, he hears this in 1844, he hears about this Stevens Party, the very first, I mentioned them earlier, the very first covered wagons to come west. And they make it to the end of that Humboldt River, but then it dead ends. In front of you is what we call the 40-mile desert. And in the gold rush, it killed several thousand people because it was so quagmire with the sand and everything. This party didn't know how to cross this desert. They knew they had to go west. They couldn't see any way past it. Chief Truckee shows up at their campsite, and by using sign language and diagrams that he sketched in the sand, he is able to get these people who really, their first initial thing is not to trust him at all, but eventually he gained their trust, and he says, basically, if you cross this desert, you'll come to this great river coming out of the mountains. You follow that river up, you'll come to a pass, you go over that pass, and you'll reach the country you're looking for. Chief Truckee had done it before. He'd been down to what later becomes Sacramento. He'd been all the way out to Santa Cruz. He'd seen the Pacific Ocean. Not too bad for an interior Indian. And ultimately, the Stevens party does cross the desert, and they come upon the river that he described to them. John Fremont had just been through 6 months before. He saw that river. He saw where, because he camped where it enters into Pyramid Lake. He and his men had feasted on this delicious lake trout. So when he sees, and he's putting his names on everything, it was Fremont that said Pyramid Lake because of the pyramid-shaped rock formation. That name stuck. We've got Carson Valley and Carson River. All these names stick. He had named what we call the Truckee River the Salmon Trout River because of this fish, huge fish population. Well, he didn't put a sign there. So the Stevens party just comes in 6 months later, and this Indian had guided them to this river that actually saves their bacon, and they follow it up and they cross the mountains. And after 11 months after starting the Stevens party, all 50 people reached California, and 2 babies were added along the way. So they were a very successful party. They are the ones credited with opening up the California Trail. So we've got to give a lot of credit to Chief Truckee for opening up the California Trail, because he was the one who steered them in the right direction. Well, Chief Truckee, we call him that because he was constantly saying a word that sounded like Truckee or Truckee or something like that. We just assumed it was his name. Well, we find out later, because, you know, Chief Truckee's married, he's got kids. His granddaughter is Sarah Winnemucca, and she becomes a very noted activist for the Paiute Nation. She is the first female Indian to ever write a book in English. We have statues of her in Carson City, Las Vegas, and in Washington, D.C. So she has gotten her recognition as well-deserved it should be. The thing that's interesting about her, and when you read the old publications, even in the newspapers, Chief Truckee lived till 1860. So he lived quite a ways past the gold rush and just after the discovery of the Comstock. But it was his granddaughter who says, "You called my grandfather Truckee because he used the word frequently." And in fact, she said, his name was Winnemucca. That was his real name. But he would use that word Truckee frequently because it meant, he's saying it to these pioneers who are scared and tired and struggling, that don't worry about it. You guys are going to make it. Everything's okay. All's well, which is what Truckee means. So the most important of our 3 rivers in our neighborhood, the Truckee River, the Carson River, and the Walker River, the most important one, the Truckee, is named for an indigenous man who helped open up the California Trail, and it's really the everything's going to be all right river. So now you know when you're having a beer at the bar, you know what to say. Well, we're going to have the gold strike kicks in January of 1848, and then the gold rush starts in earnest in 1849. That's what we call it, the 49ers. That's a big boom. It brings a lot of people west, and everybody just kept right through what was then Utah territory, just kept on going west. Well, by 1855, the gold was gone. It had all been consolidated by companies, large groups of men working together. You know, you weren't going to go out and get your own anymore. Then in 1859, some prospectors that were out here in what is now going to be the Virginia City Gold Hill area, they're out there scratching away and looking and finding little pieces of gold and things, nothing like they saw in Nevada. And it was then in 1859 that they came across some rock outcroppings that ultimately showed great promise. We end up crediting these 2 brothers, the Grosh brothers, with being the men who actually were able to gather some of these ore samples. There's hardly anybody here, but gather some of these ore samples and look and test it. They were the sons of a Presbyterian minister from Pennsylvania. They were fairly well educated. They had been taught some geology and things. They had more on the ball than most of the other prospectors in the area. The problem with them was they wanted to keep this a secret because, and I don't blame them, right? Why not? You know, look, we were discovering all this stuff. But the problem is, it's not like the early gold in California, that placer gold where an individual could go out with a pan and a pick and pull money in. This is going to require a large amount of investment to process the ore and crush it and get out these precious metals. So they don't really share the information. And then two things happen very, very quickly. One, the younger brother, Hosea, he dies in August of 1857. He is working with a pickaxe, and he punctures his foot with it. Then he gets tetanus and then blood poisoning and dies of lockjaw. Well, the surviving brother says, I've got to make this happen. I'm the only one left. My brother is gone. So he takes some more specimens. He takes some maps and the drawings and all the things that he had. And he and another man, a guy from Canada, they decide to go to California to make their claim. And as they're making their way up and over, people don't realize it today, but the Placer County Immigrant Road, the road that a lot of people use to go directly down into the Auburn area, that goes right up Squaw Valley and right down the ridge. Today, it's now the Western States Trail. It's a 100-mile endurance run for humans and for horses, the Tevis Cup. So that all became alive again, but while they're making their way over, a blizzard came in, trapped the two men. Miners found them. They were alive. They said, we have to amputate parts of your leg to the surviving brother, Ethan. He says he was delusional for whatever reason. They didn't do it. He died right there. And the secret was lost with these two guys until we go just another couple of years later, and we've got a guy named Riley and McLaughlin and some other people. Of course, Henry Comstock comes into the picture and gets his name on everything. Well, as I mentioned before, these are not going to be placer deposits. They're deep in the ground. There are some of the parts of these ore lodes, look how massive these are, that do breach the surface. And that's why they were able to actually scratch and find something in there. But ultimately, it's going to be about going deep into the earth and getting out this ore. And it's going to require a lot of heavy industry in many ways. And you can see down the vertical shafts going this way, and then the horizontal are drifts. Well, it just shows you this map, because this is the placement of all of these diggings and burrows that they're going in and all this mining excavation, how little they understood the geology of the area. Because if you know what's happening, like we would today by doing sound penetration and different testing, you would just want to go in and excavate the lode and pull it out and then find the next one and find the next one. Look how much money and effort and investment went in for exploring places that never showed up anything. But this is what's going to require a lot of money, a lot of timber, and a lot of manpower. And ultimately the timber, because Nevada is not going to be known for that much of it. And as soon as they cut out the Carson Range, the only thing was left was looking down into that Tahoe Basin. The part of it, you think, well, if I'm boring through solid granite, I just go through it just like with that Transcontinental Railroad up on Donner Pass. You can walk right in. There's no support beams for any of that tunnel work. It's solid granite. Well, the rock matrix underneath the Comstock was very weak. There's a lot of fractures. A lot of different things were going on. So it was going to require a whole bunch of support. And no one had ever done this before to this level. And it just so happens to be a German engineer, Philip Deidesheimer, who comes to this understanding. He said he was eating lunch, and he was just looked, and he saw this beehive, and he saw the honeycombs of the beehive. All of these individual cells, but all attached for great strength. That would be the honeycomb, right? So he came up with this square set timbering where you just put your supports up, then you put your braces over the top, and you can fill it in over the part of the miners. They can work in relative safety from things collapsing on them. And this is what's really going to also accelerate wood consumption. Glenbrook on the east shore of Lake Tahoe is pretty much the first settlement of the area. They went in there, they were growing potatoes and onions and things like that. But ultimately, this is going to be taken over by this wood harvesting that's going to be in the Tahoe Basin for the Comstock. So it became a huge thing. So we had different railroads going up towards Luther Pass, which is where Highway 50 is at South Lake Tahoe, that whole valley there. There was a railroad that went in that way. There was a railroad at what is today Sand Harbor. There was a railroad down where Glenbrook is. We had all these small logging operations. Trees are going to be cut down, and if they're not milled on site, the raw trees cut into lumber, usable lumber, they're going to be pushed into the lake and towed over by these little tugboats in these giant rafts of trees that are limbed and the branches are all gone. And then you take it to Glenbrook, where they are then cut from the raw timber into lumber, and then going to be brought up to the ridge line and then brought down to the Carson Valley in our water flumes. And today Glenbrook is a gated community, but it has come back beautifully from the ravaged days. You can see all the trees are gone and everything else. No, wasn't really safe to be a tree in the Tahoe Basin at that time, that's for sure. And part of this is going to be Henry Arrington, who becomes the general superintendent, chief executive of the Virginia and Truckee Railroad, when that comes in later. But he's working with another guy, Dwain Bliss. These are the guys that gather together all these timber rights and are running these massive operations. And down in Glenbrook, which is going to be down on the beach here where all the mills are, well, you had to get the wood way up to the ridge line to get it to where these water flumes are going to be. How did they do it? They put in a switchback railroad that went right up the face of the mountain to the top, where the cut lumber would then be transferred into the flumes. Often they would not be working on Sundays, and families, particularly from Reno, Carson City, would come up to the lake area, and they would run their, they're not carrying any wood at this point, they would run these people along these switchbacks going right up the face of the mountain up towards the summit area, what they called Devil's Gate. And you can see everybody gets dressed up. This was really a really thrilling ride that they eventually prohibited anybody from doing it anymore. It became too dangerous. And this is a classic view, in a sense, of what we might think of when you think of the water flumes. And yeah, I heard that there were some stories of some of the lumberjacks riding down on the wood. Well, the thing that you got to realize, this is the artist's version of his fantasy, is see, this is a raw log like this. It would have all been cut lumber already. But the fact is, it does come flying down. It was cheap and easy, and then it comes down into here where there was this huge lumber yard where it could be picked up ultimately by the Virginia and Truckee Railroad. You can see this is Carson City to the north, so this is a huge amount of cut wood that is now being taken from the Tahoe Basin and being put underneath the ground of Virginia City. And that's why when they say, if you think about the original old-growth forest of Lake Tahoe, that is rotting underground between 500 and 3,000 feet beneath the surface, because we pretty much took it all. And by 1890s, this is looking up at the Spooner Summit area, completely denuded. Well, not completely, about 10% of the basin's forest was spared for a variety of reasons, primarily because it was already owned. Parcels were already owned by some private property. There were some hostelries and things of that nature. That was the area that did not get cut, and pretty much everything else did. By 1894, you could come up to Lake Tahoe, including lakefront, and get an acre of land for $1.50. That was the time to invest in Lake Tahoe, trust me. And one of the ramifications of all of that was, once the trees started to grow back, we went into this national policy of controlling all forest fires. Never let anything burn. When the first pioneers reached the Tahoe Basin in the early 1860s, late 1850s, and it was the original forest, they said it was like a park. Large statuesque trees, widely spaced, no understory. You could ride a horse at a gallop. Today, you need a machete to get half through that Tahoe forest, because we have not let anything burn And now we're trying to do it a little bit more of an expensive way, and really the safest way is to go in and cut the trees by choosing the weak ones, the too densely packed ones. They call it select timber harvest. Cut them, and drag them out, and try to leave the forest more open. And then also do what we call low-grade burns. Pull this slash together from dropping all these trees and taking them out, and then burn them, and then allow a very low-grade burn to go around the tree trunks and burn its way. That way, if a forest fire that's a wildfire that gets caught out of control and comes into that kind of an area, the burn is going to go way down, and it's going to take it from being up in the canopies of the forest and just make it really a beneficial low-intensity burn along the ground itself. But we have lots of issues because every time they try, if you drive up around the lake, you'll see these piles of slash. They thought they were going to burn them every year. Some of these things have been there for 5 years. It's because you have to get the right weather. You have to get people complain all the time now because I smell smoke. There's smoke near my house. Well, we're just trying to burn this stuff out. So it's a real juggling act to make this happen, but they are working on it little by little. The V&T was the big deal, and it was primarily an economic thing in the sense that you got to look at this kind of how it all was working. First of all, you're going to have all this wood and all this ore and everything that has to be moved around is going to be hauled in these large freight wagons pulled by horses, mules, and oxen. It's very expensive, and it took time and everything else. It took a lot of money out of the mining profits. Well, the V&T is going to be something that helps alleviate that issue. And a lot of people didn't believe, just like the Transcontinental, a lot of people didn't believe that the V&T could actually put in there. And when they describe it, when they talk about the crookedest railroad in the world, one of the reasons that they're saying that is because there are so many curves in the line of the V&T that if you put them all together, it would actually describe about 17 complete circles. So that's about how much that they had to use to get it up there. And here is one of the mining operations. They're pulling out all of the ore, and these are going to be the draft animals that are going to be pulling all the ore. And the thing was, initially, you've got these giant pistons that are crushing the ore and making this sandy matrix. Then you run mercury through it. This is why the Carson River is so contaminated. You run liquid mercury through it, and it creates this slurry, right? Well, that mercury gathers up the silver and the gold, and you can push the waste rock over here and get the slurry over here. And because mercury has such a low boiling point, all you have to do is heat it up. The mercury evaporates again. You catch it in a still, like a whiskey still, and recondense it to use it again. And that mercury, as it evaporates, leaves behind the precious metal. Dirty business, expensive business, and all of this had a huge impact. And if you're trying to run these pistons with a steam boiler when you're just feeding it cordwood, a huge amount of wood. So all the trees that weren't really good for lumber were also being sucked up and used to keep these steam boilers going, until finally they realized, how about if we take and put the mills, the crushing mills, all down on the Carson River, where the current will drive water wheels and give us hydropower instead of using steam boilers. And that's going to be a great thing for the mining operations. However, you still have to get all that ore from up on the Comstock all the way down to the mills on the Carson River. And this is one of the things when they bring in the railroad can be there to pick up the cut timber from Lake Tahoe, bring it up to the Comstock, dump all the lumber off, fill all the cars with the ore that has now been extracted. The railroad can take the ore down to the Carson Mills and the river, dump it all there, and then, in the meantime, can also go up and connect up to Reno on the Transcontinental line and bring in freight and supplies and things that are coming mostly from California. Now, the railroad finally was starting to go down in the 1940s, and the V&T ended up selling off a lot of their rolling stock and a lot of their locomotives, and they have appeared now in more than 100 movies. So it's gone in a sense, but you could still see it in places if you look at these different movies and check out the old locomotives and everything else. One of the big deals for the miners themselves, Yes, you have to go down into these very deep pits and tunnels, and it's very hot, and the air is stifling, and the risk of water shooting in, superheated water shooting in from weak parts in the walls and things of that nature, very high risk. This gentleman, another German engineer, Adolph Sutro, he said, I've got a great idea. If all of the mine shafts are going down from the summit vertically down and then stopping, what happens if I do a tunnel underneath all of them? That's going to make three great things. Instead of having to hoist all the ore up against gravity up to the surface, we can just lower it to these ore cars that are going to be on this track at the bottom of these new shafts. If the men got trapped because of fire or boiling water, we can bring them down this way and out. And once these connect, once this horizontal tunnel connects with the vertical shaft, it will create a chimney effect, like a flue effect, and bring all this fresh air, and that will go surging up through the mines. I mean, these were all great ideas. The concern was the mining operators, and most particularly the Bank of California out of San Francisco, had the controlling interest on a lot of the mills and the mines, and they were afraid if Sutro pulled this off, he would take control of all the situation. So they put a lot of roadblocks in his way. It took 9 years for this to finally happen, and by the time the tunnel was complete and everything that he said was going to come true, the mines were going down in decline because we had run out of all the economically producible ore at the time. He eventually went and took his money, went back and became a mayor in San Francisco. And one of his things about Adolph Sutro that I liked, he always had an interest in the families of the common man. And that's why he started several things. He started the Sutro baths in San Francisco that were famous. He says, it only cost a nickel, so any working man and his family can come here on a Sunday. He put a trolley in that only cost a nickel. He put in the Sutro Heights, which was all landscaped and open to the public for free. And these were things that will be wholesome for the families of the workforce. And there's something to be said about that. Well, of course, Sam Clemens comes out right around this time in 1861. You know, he always said, I don't like to work really hard physically. And one of the first things he did was got into mining, mostly speculating in the mines, and that was a money loser. He's losing all of his money as he's speculating in these mines because it's really hit and miss. He's tried to dig a little bit. That turned out to be hard work. So that's why he came out of mining saying, a mine is nothing but a hole in the ground owned by a liar. And he has a point. The other thing is, he didn't like the name Tahoe. He had issues with the Paiute and Washoe Indians, Mark Twain did. But you got to realize he becomes a writer here on the Comstock in the heyday of that whole thing where everything was out of control and over the top. He almost was in 3 separate duels because of things he wrote in the newspaper. He's making fun of people. He's making fun of another editor. He's making fun of this. And everybody's putting something in the other newspaper saying, oh, well, he's this guy. Everything was over the top. And he said that the word Tahoe doesn't mean edge of the lake or big water or anything like that. It means grasshopper soup. Now, I've never seen grasshopper soup, but I would assume it's lumpy and green. And that's a far cry from what Lake Tahoe is. He considered Lake Tahoe one of the most beautiful, even after traveling Europe, he always thought still the most beautiful lake he had ever seen his whole life. And when he first saw it, he was very impressed. So this is going to be a problem for him later, as in last year and this year. So what happens, I have 2 friends of mine. One's David Antonucci out of Tahoe City, Homewood area in Lake Tahoe. The other is Bob Stewart out of Nevada. Both these guys have written books. Both of these books are going to be about when Mark Twain came up to Lake Tahoe to start a timber claim, which was a bust, but he came up and he wrote about this trip in his book, Roughing It, which came out about 9 years later, right? So it's not like perfectly fact as the time. Stewart reads the book and does his research and says, all right, well, I know where Mark Twain camped at Lake Tahoe in that story in Roughing It. Because of all these things I'm showing you, plus, after doing some exploration, He found, this is just below Sand Harbor there on the east shore, he found this rock. And Mark Twain writes about that rock in his book. They're playing faro. They're playing cards on it. They're like poker. And they're sitting around it in the sand playing on this perfectly level, round rock that was like a table. Well, you know, there's a lot of interesting rocks there, particularly on the east shore, the way they erode. But that's a very definitive rock, in my opinion. So Stewart puts all this together, and he says, this is where they camped. Well, David Antonucci does a different way, and he reads, because Mark Twain was an ex-riverboat pilot, and Twain writes about the colors of the water as he's in a rowboat, and talking about how deep the water is and the colors. Antonucci extrapolates from that in fact, Mark Twain did get down towards the east part of the lake, which is Nevada, but ultimately he took a rowboat and rolled over past where the state line is today, near where I live in Carnelian Bay, and that's where he went. All right, last year in 2013, because several people, my buddy Guy Roshan, these other historians, had come together to the Nevada Board of Geographic Names, and they said, we want to name a cove, an unnamed cove, right where Mark Twain would have been. We want to name it Clemens Cove. So the board convenes, the Nevada historians do their piece. Board looks like, this sounds good to us. There's no name of Mark Twain anywhere around here, or Clemens. They said, that sounds good. David Antonucci shows up and says, this is what I've written, and this is what I think. And the board's like, now we're not as convinced. They said, we're going to revisit, this is 2013, they said, we will revisit it this year in May. This year in May, David Antonucci shows up, Bob Stewart and his posse shows up. Who else comes into the picture? The Washoe Indian tribe. They said, this guy, Mark Twain, or Sam Clemens, whatever you want to call him, when he wrote about Indians 150, 160 years ago now, right? When he wrote about our tribe, he called us Digger Indians. Now, maybe it's not the most flattering term. It was a common term used by many pioneers and Americans because the Indians were often on the ground digging for roots, tubers of plants, and for rodents, which they would cook and eat. So it was a common thing. That describes what they were often like when they were going for food. They said, that is a negative connotation, and if it's up to us, there will never be a Twain name or a Clemens name anywhere in our ancestral homeland. And the board, Geographic Names, signs off and says, that's it, game over. So that whole fight is now done. But 2 days later, this editorial came out in the paper, and this shows you Mark Twain at the beach. And the thing about it is it has a campfire, because that story is that night when Twain and his buddy are cooking dinner, the flames, sparks get caught up into the pine needles and then burn up the side of the hill. They, in fact, were so intimidated, they got in the rowboat and rowed out and watched it. He ends up getting busted for that and fined in Carson City because that was privately owned timber that he ended up burning down. This is the 150th anniversary of the state of Nevada, right? 1864, 2014. Last year was the 150th of the establishment of the town of Truckee and Tahoe City. So big anniversary seasons right now. The interesting thing that comes about is Abraham Lincoln, we're still in the Civil War. We're in 1864 now. Abraham Lincoln is running for re-election. No one knew how that election was going to go. The South was losing the war. But many, many Northerners who had lost brothers, sisters, everybody, fathers, the whole thing, we know how bad the American Civil War was. They said, you know what? If this war is going to cost us this many people, let them go. Let the Southern states secede. And so nobody knew if Lincoln was going to be reelected. He ends up winning in a landslide, but nobody's sure yet, right? Nevada says, well, we want to become a state right now. We've become a territory in 1861. Now we want to become a state, and we will send you our 3 electoral votes. And so the Republican Party, Lincoln's party, says, oh, this sounds great. Send us your state constitution. We'll ratify it. You will become a state, and we'll get those electoral votes. Well, the acting governor sends it by ship and sends it by stage and we're getting very close to the election, and it hasn't reached Washington for approval, so they can't vote. So finally, acting territorial governor goes to the Carson City post office, and he talks to the clerk. He says, I've got a document here. It's only about 17,000 words, but I need you to key this in Morse code and send it back to Washington, D.C. It took him 7 hours, and it only got to Salt Lake City. Then that guy had to key it in for 7 hours to Chicago, to New York, to D.C. It finally gets there. The way I read it, Congress never even looked at it. Approval, the votes are tallied, and that's it. So Nevada got in without much vetting, let's put it that way. And yes, we do have the V&T is back and up and running again. I haven't had the chance to get on it yet, but I send people down as often as I can. And maybe it doesn't look as well and as sharp as it used to, but the fact is, I think it's a great accomplishment to the communities to have gotten this thing up and running again, back on mostly on its own original right-of-way going back. And now you've got that Comstock mining. I'm sure everybody's read a little bit about it. They expect to go in there. When this first came out like 3 years ago, I know that they were talking about taking all the old mining data, crushing it in a computer. The computer tells it where to go to do the best activity for this missing loads of ore. And they were talking about pulling out close to $10 billion worth of precious metal. I don't know what's happening. I hear different things, that the money's not as good as everybody was saying. But I do know that there has been a big pushback from both Virginia City, Gold Hill, and all those communities up there for the reactivization of all of this pretty dirty business, I guess you could say, mining is. And I got just a few stories about Lake Tahoe. This gentleman's Captain Barter. He's a retired British Naval Sea Captain. He worked for a guy named Ben Holliday. Holliday had a staging coach operation that went from Colorado to California. Huge deal. Well, between the Donner Party incident and then the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, everybody used Carson Pass, south of the lake. That was the main pass. Well, Holliday's stage is going to go over that Carson Pass. And he came through Lake Tahoe. He's scoping it out. He sees Emerald Bay. He preempts the land and takes it for himself. Nobody was there yet. Builds a house there. But he's not going to be around. He wants somebody to be at the house during the winter months, but it's going to be snowbound. So he hires Captain Dick Barter, this naval captain, and the thing is, the lake never freezes. So if Barter needs to get away and get supplies or anything, he can get out on a sailboat and go to different places on the lake. There's not going to be much going on at the time, that's for sure. The only bar in Tahoe that he could get to in the late 1860s and by 1870 was in Tahoe City. One day he gets in his boat, he rows his way up to Tahoe City, he's drinking for a while, probably says, oh, it's getting dark, I better get out of here. Well, it's January of 1870. He gets back into his rowboat, he starts rowing back to Emerald Bay. Well, a wind comes in and the lake gets all chopped up and he gets pushed and blown out of the boat turns over, and now he's soaking wet. Well, he gets the boat uprighted, he gets himself back in, but it's really cold, he's freezing and everything. He knows he's not going to make it unless he gets back to his house. So he starts rowing as hard as he can. That probably is what saved his life. He rows and rows. I'll never surrender. Captain Barter never surrenders. He rows into Emerald Bay. He pretty much falls out of the boat at the pier, and he crawls into bed. Well, he survives, but he suffers frostbite on both of his feet. So he can't walk for a while. He puts pillows. He ties pillows to his knees, and he gets around on his knees. Well, he's bored. This is an industrious, independent man. So he ends up building this scale model warship with 200 little men that he carved out of wood and painted their uniforms, and he had a clock in there that ran the rudder and all these different things. And that summer, he's feeling a little bit better, and he doesn't like that rowboat. He builds himself an 8,000-pound sailboat. This is now how he's going to get around the lake. Well, the thing about that is nobody knows any of this stuff has happened until August of the same year of 1870, when a reporter from the San Francisco newspaper came up, and he's writing stories about color and characters of Lake Tahoe. Well, people in Tahoe City said, oh, you got to go down and check out that hermit at Emerald Bay, man. He's a total nutcase, right? Bring him a couple of bottles of whiskey, he'll love to talk to you. So the reporter shows up, he's got some whiskey, and Barter brings him in, and he tells him the whole story just like I told you. He says, oh, yeah, I fell on my boat, and this, that, I built this, I did this. And the reporter's like, man, it's hard to believe that you were able to pull any of that off. I do see the evidence of your work with the model boat and then the brand new boat on the pier and everything. And he says, I knew that people wouldn't believe me. Barter gets up and he goes over to his dresser drawer and he pulls out a jewelry box and he gives it to the reporter, who opens it up, and inside are Captain Barter's toes, which he had cut off from frostbite damage, but he had also salted them to preserve them as a memento so he could show people that that's what happened to him too. Well, he lived right here, and of course we have F.A.M.E Island today. He lived right here, and this is Emerald Bay because a glacier came down here and pushed its way through and broke through the level of the lake, and this glacier came down here, this is Cascade Lake, but pushed all the debris in front of it and never made it to the main lake at large. So this is the road goes right on the ridge. It's an awesome place right here. And Captain Barter, this guy was an older guy, knew he lived a rough lifestyle and everything. He knew he saw the grizzly bears, almost got killed by an avalanche one time and all these things. So he was ready to die at any point. So what he ended up doing was he went out onto the island and he built he cut like into the rock a little bit, a small place for a coffin. And he put his own wooden coffin in there. Then he built a little chapel over it. And he says, when I'm ready to die, I'm just going to row my boat over to the island. I'm going to get in the coffin. I'm going to shut the lid, and I'll be done with it, right? Well, everybody wants to do it that way. But ultimately, that's not what happens. He's coming back from a new saloon at South Shore. The wind picks up. The sailboat turns over, he drowns in 1,000 feet of water, and his body is never recovered. And when you look at that island and you see the little granite feature, it's not his old chapel, it's Laura Knight's tea house that she had built when she eventually got the property later. Dwain Bliss was one of these, as I mentioned before. He was with Henry Arrington, big timber baron, made a lot of money. The whole place is trashed. He looks around and says, when these trees grow back, this is going to be a beautiful place, and I'm going to be the guy who makes money off of that phase of Lake Tahoe too. Late 1890s, he goes down to San Francisco, and he has this ship built by some steel workers there. Ultimately, it's put together. Beautiful boat. Put together, then they took parts of it apart, put it on the train, brought it up to Reno. Reno on the V&T, down to the end, and then up and over by oxen-drawn wagon, over Spooner Summit, down to Glenbrook, put together and launched. This is going to be the beginning of his three-part thing. The second thing is to build a beautiful hotel. So he builds the Tahoe Tavern right there at Tahoe City and everything, and now he needs the final link. Got all these defunct railroad logging operations in the basin. Everybody's gone. They're all just laying there starting to rust. It's Bliss who says, I'll give you a nickel for that locomotive. I'll give you 40 cents for that whole stretch of track. Everybody sold him everything. It was all put on rafts from all around the lake, brought over to Tahoe City, and he launches the Lake Tahoe Truckee Railway, which connects Tahoe City and Truckee on the main line. And this was a big deal. He ordered up the coaches out of a defunct narrow gauge out of Carson City. And ultimately, he really had a thinking that this was really going to be about tourism, but ultimately he made most of the money by putting in 2 more stretches of track. One south of Tahoe City down the West Shore and into Ward Canyon, and another into Squaw Valley. And the timbering kept on going, and you can see that the thick logs are being taken up to Truckee, where all the mills were still located along the railroad. And that was part of the economy that kept it going. Here you can see when loaded with passengers, the train would back up on a 900-foot-long pier right out onto the lake, and the train's here, and here comes the steamer to pick you up and then take you around to the different locations. And it was really when the automobile became popular, and it's the same way today. We try to get people, Tahoe's gridlocked. Man, just July 4th, I was ready to shoot myself. You couldn't even go anywhere. And they're like, well, we want people on buses. We want this, we want this. Well, I'll tell you right now, when Mom, Dad, Buddy, and Sis come up to Lake Tahoe from the Bay Area or from whatever, they've got 2 kayaks, 4 bicycles, all this stuff. You're never going to get them out of that car. You're never. It's just from point A to point B, and it's been that way for 50 years. And here's this old narrow gauge, very colorful line, And this is the old right-of-way. We made it into a bike path that connects Tahoe City, and it's a beautiful ride right on the water with no cars or anything else. So that really worked out well. This guy, von Schmidt, came in as an engineer. He wanted to take Tahoe water and send it to San Francisco in 1870. He was going to dig a canal through Squaw Valley to the upper end of the valley and then bore a tunnel out to the other side, the west slope. We just had finished the Transcontinental Railroad, so the right-of-way is all there. All you got to do is get that water out of Tahoe, bring it onto the other side, and then run it all down the tracks, right along the tracks. And then in the Sacramento Valley, you got pumping stations to bring it all along till it reaches Hunters Point. Well, Nevada heard about this. They said, you think you're building a dam and you're diverting that water? Well, von Schmidt said, I'm going to put a dam at the outlet of the lake, and then I'm going to put one downstream about 5 miles right at Squaw Valley and divert it there. And he said, the lake is in, 2/3 of the lake is in California, the outlet's in California, my diversion dams are in California. Nevada says, if you build it, we're going to blow it up. It's our water. And the feds came out and says, whoa, 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 what's going on? This is the beginning of our water wars. And in fact, the feds came down on the side of Nevada because of Western water law is based on prior appropriation. Means first in time, first in right. First person divert the water by time. This is happening in the 1870s. Nevada says, we've been diverting water downstream for agricultural purposes for a long time. And the Fed says, Nevada's right. And ultimately now, when we look up at those bodies of water, that dam at Tahoe City holds back 6 feet 1 inch at its maximum. 99% of that water is owned and controlled by Nevada. When you look at Donner Lake, coming up after Labor Day weekend, you're going to see that lake go down, 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 because Nevada owns the top 12 feet of Donner Lake. And then Independence Lake, even further up on 89 North, Nevada owns all that water too. And these are all controlled to try to make this happen. I was doing a presentation, not today, but I did a presentation on the Newlands Irrigation District and the diversion of water out of the Truckee River all the way down and out into the driest place of the United States. If let's say we're in a 3rd year of a drought right now, and let's say it's just the beginning of what turns out to be a 12-year drought. Let me just throw that out there, right? And they're going to be really hard up for water out of Reno. Well, I always think that the low-hanging fruit is going to be the Newlands Irrigation District. Yes, I know it's going to take, the lawyers are going to make a bunch of money trying to divert that water back upstream again, but if you're going to have 300,000 people here and not enough water, and then you have some farming operations out in the hinterlands, to me, as they always said, water flows uphill to money, and I think it will flow to Reno. And here's my last story. This is one of my favorite ones. This is Myrtle Huddleston. Now, she's just a homemaker mom back in the Midwest, and you know, she's almost 30 years old. She's 30 years old, and a friend says, you know what, let's go to this local lake. It's a beautiful place. And she's like, oh, I've never gone swimming before. Well, she goes out there, she frolics around, and it turns out she's a pretty good swimmer because 2 years later, she swims the English Channel, which is 22 miles open ocean. Becomes one of the first women to do it, right? Then she hears up at Lake Tahoe, it's 1932, right in the heart of the Great Depression, and Tahoe's business is suffering too. And that Tahoe Tavern, the Tahoe Hotel there, they said, we're going to drum up some business. We want to bring in some tourism. So we're going to offer a cash reward. We're going to put in all the papers. We're going to offer a cash reward because no one's ever done this before. You have to swim from the Nevada side to the California side to our hotel, and we will pay you the cash. Well, Myrtle now has already swum the English Channel, which is going to be a little bit further than this in Lake Tahoe. So she comes up in August of 1932. By now, she's got a manager and a support unit, the whole thing. They show up, base camp's over there at the Tahoe Tavern. Well, they bring her over here. This is Sand Harbor. And she starts off down here near Glenbrook at a place called Dead Man's Point, which is a pretty auspicious start. It does jut out. She covers her skin with a real thick layer of grease and fat to protect her from the cold water. 7 o'clock in the morning, she dives in and she starts to swim. Well, in general, particularly in the summer, Tahoe is dead calm in the morning and pretty breezy in the afternoon. This happens to be a really windy day already. She dives in. She wants to just swim directly to Tahoe City, maybe 12 miles, maybe less, just straight across the lake. The waves are hitting her and hitting her. Now, she's got 2 escort boats with her, 2 little motorboats. It's not a suicide mission, but they can't help her. So she's immediately blown off course, and instead of going across the lake, now she's being blown. She's got to go around every point and through every cove and just try to stay away from the rocks as the water's breaking over and all this kind of stuff. Well, she's swimming and swimming and swimming. Then the sun sets. Usually when the sun sets, energy diminishes. The lake becomes calm, and it does. So at midnight, she breaks out the crawl. Now she's power swimming. She swims away from her escort boats. So these guys, it's like 12:30 at night. These guys are like, Myrtle, Myrtle. They don't hear anything. They're like, well, we'll get her in the morning. So they go back to the hotel to wait. There's a whole crowd of people there. And then they send out a dozen motorboats at first light. We got to find her, right? One of the boats comes upon her quite quickly. She's just treading water. She's not swimming at all. She can barely stay afloat. And she's like, pull me out. I've got muscle spasms. I haven't eaten in 24 hours. I can't do it. Who's on the boat? Her 15-year-old son, who says, Mom, you can do it. I can hear them cheering for you now. You're not that far away. She's like, well, get out of my way. She starts swimming again, and 23 hours after she started, she reaches the beach. They've got an ambulance there with the stretcher. She pretty much crawls and stumbles her way in, and they give her $700 cash, which is worth $11,000 today, and she becomes the first person to swim across Lake Tahoe. And that's it. I'm done. So thank you very much.